The most terrifying horror stories from Uber drivers. Ride-sharing algorithms contain classified subroutines that no driver will ever see, designed to manage passenger requests that originate from coordinates outside normal GPS mapping systems, destinations that exist in temporal spaces between documented addresses, and payment methods that process transactions using currency from currencies that haven't been minted yet. These hidden protocols reveal that approximately 8% of late-night ride requests involve entities whose transportation needs exceed standard human travel requirements. Uber drivers operating during peak supernatural hours between 2 a.m. and 5 a.m. become inadvertent transporters for passengers whose destinations, payment methods, and conversation topics violate every assumption about normal human travel patterns and geographical limitations. These drivers discover that ride-sharing technology creates perfect camouflage for entities who need vehicular transportation between dimensional spaces that exist parallel to normal urban infrastructure. If you really like what we are doing here, please press that like button. Even a comment will help the channel by pushing the algorithm to show your favorite channel to others. And this helps us to summon more horror stories. Every single night. Number 5. The passenger verification. I drove for Uber for 5 years before October 2022, when I picked up a passenger who made me understand that ride-sharing algorithms sometimes generate pickup requests from individuals whose existence violates basic principles of human biology, temporal continuity, and physical matter consistency. Late-night ride-sharing means transporting passengers whose identity verification exceeds what standard background checking or customer safety protocols could possibly confirm. My driving schedule focused on weekend late-night shifts when demand peaked, and surge pricing created optimal earning opportunities. I would position myself near entertainment districts, airport terminals, and hotel areas where travelers needed reliable transportation during hours when public transit options were limited or unavailable for safe navigation. The pickup request that changed everything came through my app at 3:17 a.m., displaying passenger information that seemed completely normal. 5-star rating, verified account, standard pickup location at a downtown hotel, destination address in a suburban residential area approximately 25 minutes away. The ride appeared routine until I arrived at the specified pickup location. When I reached the hotel entrance, the passenger who approached my vehicle matched the profile photo in my app? Exactly, but his physical appearance possessed characteristics that didn't align with normal human biology. His skin had a waxy translucency that revealed circulatory patterns underneath. His movements demonstrated joint flexibility that exceeded normal human skeletal limitation, and his breathing followed rhythms that didn't match standard respiratory patterns. But most disturbing was how the passenger spoke with multiple voices simultaneously, creating conversational responses that included overlapping vocal patterns, as if several individuals were speaking through single vocal cords. When I attempted to verify his identity through standard passenger confirmation protocols, he provided information that matched my app display perfectly, despite his obviously non-human physical characteristics. During the drive, the passenger demonstrated knowledge about my personal life that exceeded what ride-sharing customer information could provide. He knew details about my family relationships, employment history, and financial situation with accuracy that suggested comprehensive surveillance of my private activities, extending far beyond ride-sharing service interactions. When I attempted to navigate to his destination address, my GPS began displaying route options that included streets and highways that didn't exist in Detroit's transportation infrastructure. The passenger would provide detailed directions that led through areas I couldn't recognize despite 5 years of professional driving experience throughout the metropolitan region, roads that seemed to materialize as we traveled and disappear from my rear-view mirror. But the horrifying escalation occurred when I realized that the passenger was gradually consuming physical matter from my vehicle's interior during the ride. Seat fabric would show signs of systematic absorption wherever he maintained contact. Plastic dashboard components would begin softening and integrating into his clothing, and even metal door handles would show corrosion patterns that suggested biological acid secretion. My investigation during subsequent shifts revealed that multiple Uber drivers throughout the region were receiving pickup requests from passengers with similar non-human characteristics who were using ride-sharing services to access locations that existed beyond normal urban geographical boundaries. These entities were coordinating transportation activities that served purposes exceeding standard travel requirements. When I attempted to report these anomalous passenger encounters through Uber's customer safety protocols, I discovered that the ride records showed completely normal trip histories with standard passenger ratings and payment processing, despite my detailed documentation of supernatural passenger characteristics and impossible destination navigation. The situation escalated when the non-human passengers began requesting rides that exceeded normal temporal duration limits. Trips would continue for hours beyond what GPS navigation indicated should be required, with passengers claiming that their destination addresses existed in temporal spaces that required extended travel through dimensional corridors that intersected with normal highway infrastructure only during specific time periods. But the most terrifying discovery was that passengers were using ride-sharing transportation to harvest biological material from human drivers through prolonged physical contact during extended trip durations. They were systematically extracting cellular components, DNA samples, and neurological tissue through skin contact methods that left drivers with memory gaps, physical deterioration, and cognitive impairment that developed gradually over multiple passenger encounters. My final Uber shift occurred when I realized that my own biological composition was being modified through repeated exposure to non-human passengers who were converting my cellular structure to serve as compatible interface system for their transportation requirements. My body was becoming adapted to facilitate their dimensional travel needs while gradually losing human biological characteristics. When non-human passengers offered me permanent employment opportunities that would provide significantly better compensation than standard ride-sharing earnings in exchange for exclusive transportation services between dimensional locations that existed beyond normal geographical boundaries, I understood that Uber drivers were being systematically recruited for supernatural transportation networks. I discontinued ride-sharing and destroyed my vehicle to eliminate contamination from non-human passenger contact, but I continued receiving pickup requests through ride-sharing apps I had deleted months earlier. According to these persistent notifications, my transportation services had been integrated into supernatural travel networks that operated independently of my personal involvement. The messages explained that ride-sharing drivers provide essential transportation infrastructure for entities whose travel requirements exceed normal vehicular capabilities and serve both human urban mobility needs and supernatural territorial coordination objectives that require reliable transportation between dimensional spaces that exist parallel to standard urban infrastructure systems. Number 4. The Destination Protocol. I drove for Uber for 6 years before August 2021, when I received destination addresses that led to locations where human passengers should never be delivered, and where completing drop-off protocols required navigating through dimensional spaces that violated every principle of urban geography and spatial consistency. Professional ride-sharing means accepting destination requests that exceed normal transportation service boundaries and create liability situations that no insurance policy or legal framework could adequately address. My driving experience specialized in San Francisco's complex urban navigation requirements. Steep hills, narrow streets, complicated traffic patterns, and diverse neighborhood characteristics that created challenging but manageable transportation scenarios for drivers familiar with the city's geographical layout and local traffic management systems. The problematic destination requests began appearing during my late-night shifts when passengers would provide addresses that my GPS system couldn't locate through standard mapping databases. But my ride-sharing app would generate navigation routes that included detailed turn-by-turn directions for reaching these impossible locations through familiar San Francisco street networks. When I followed app-generated navigation to these non-existent addresses, I would discover that normal city streets would gradually transform into environments that shouldn't exist within urban geographical boundaries. Familiar neighborhoods would shift into architectural configurations that included medieval structures, industrial complexes from different historical periods, and landscape features that belonged in rural or wilderness environments rather than metropolitan areas. But most disturbing was how passengers requesting these impossible destinations demonstrated comprehensive knowledge about the transformation processes occurring during navigation to their drop-off locations. They would provide detailed explanations about dimensional transition procedures, safety protocols for temporal navigation, and behavioral guidelines for interacting with entities that inhabited the destination areas. The passengers weren't random travelers seeking transportation to unusual locations, but professional coordinators who were using ride-sharing services to transport human delivery personnel to facilities that operated beyond normal commercial business regulations and zoning restrictions. They were facilitating access to locations where human drivers served essential logistical functions for supernatural commercial operations. When I attempted to refuse completing trips to impossible destinations, passengers would explain that ride-sharing algorithms had specifically selected me based on psychological evaluation metrics that identified drivers whose personality characteristics made them suitable for expanded transportation responsibilities that included dimensional navigation and entity interaction protocols. My investigation revealed that multiple Uber drivers throughout the Bay Area were receiving destination requests to the same impossible locations, but were experiencing different environmental transformations during navigation depending on their individual psychological compatibility with supernatural transportation requirements. The destinations were adapting to accommodate different driver capability levels. The situation escalated when passengers began requesting return trip transportation from impossible destination locations back to normal San Francisco addresses, creating round-trip transportation cycles that required drivers to navigate between standard urban environments and supernatural facilities multiple times during single-shift periods. But the horrifying reality was that completing transportation cycles between normal destinations and supernatural facilities was gradually converting drivers' vehicles into dimensional interface systems that maintained permanent connection to supernatural transportation networks. Our cars were becoming anchored to both normal and supernatural geographical systems simultaneously. When I attempted to research vehicle modification effects through automotive service providers, I discovered that cars used for supernatural transportation developed mechanical characteristics that exceeded normal automotive engineering specifications. These vehicles could navigate impossible terrain, maintain operation without standard fuel requirements, and provide navigation capabilities that included access to locations beyond normal GPS mapping systems. My final ride-sharing trip occurred when a passenger's destination address led to a facility where I discovered dozens of other Uber drivers who had completed similar impossible destination deliveries and were now providing permanent transportation services for supernatural operations that required reliable human driver coordination and dimensional navigation expertise. The facility coordinator explained that ride-sharing drivers who demonstrated compatibility with supernatural destination protocols were offered employment opportunities that included excellent compensation, comprehensive benefits, and professional development training, but required permanent residence at supernatural transportation facilities that existed beyond normal geographical boundaries. I declined their employment offer and attempted to return to San Francisco, but discovered that my vehicle had become permanently integrated into supernatural transportation networks that prevented navigation back to normal urban infrastructure. My car would only respond to GPS destinations that led to supernatural facilities and other drivers who were providing dimensional transportation services. I abandoned my vehicle and reported my experiences to ride-sharing customer service, but discovered that my driver account showed no record of completing trips to impossible destinations and indicated completely normal ride history with standard passenger ratings and payment processing throughout my entire driving career. However, I continued receiving transportation requests through ride-sharing apps that I had deleted, messages from passengers who claimed I was still providing dimensional transportation services for supernatural facilities that were expanding throughout metropolitan areas. According to their communications, my navigation expertise had become integrated into supernatural transportation networks that operated independently of my personal involvement. They explained that ride-sharing drivers provide essential transportation infrastructure for supernatural operations that require reliable navigation between normal urban environments and dimensional facilities that serve both human commercial needs and supernatural business objectives whose purposes include coordinating territorial expansion and resource management activities that exceed normal commercial transportation requirements. Number 3. The temporal displacement. I drove for Uber for 7 years before November 2020, when I began experiencing ride requests that created temporal displacement during transportation, delivering passengers to their correct destinations, but arriving at time periods that violated chronological continuity and required passengers to coordinate their travel schedules across multiple historical eras simultaneously. Late-night ride-sharing means providing transportation services that exceed normal temporal limitations and create scheduling complications that no time management system could effectively coordinate. My Chicago driving experience included comprehensive knowledge of the city's transportation infrastructure, traffic patterns, and neighborhood characteristics developed through years of professional navigation experience. I could efficiently transport passengers between any locations within the metropolitan area, using optimal route selection and timing coordination that minimized travel duration and maximized customer satisfaction. The temporal displacement incidents began during a particularly dark November nights when ride requests would generate normal pickup and destination addresses, but completing these trips would result in arrival at destination locations during time periods that didn't correspond to normal chronological progression. Passengers would be delivered to their correct addresses but in past or future time periods. Initially, I assumed these temporal inconsistencies were caused by technical malfunctions with my vehicle's electronic systems, but passengers would confirm that temporal displacement was occurring intentionally and represented upgraded transportation services that exceeded standard ride-sharing capabilities. They were deliberately traveling across time periods, using ride-sharing technology as temporal navigation interface. But most disturbing was how passengers requesting temporal displacement transportation possessed detailed knowledge about specific historical periods and future timeframes that they needed to access for business meetings, family visits, and professional appointments that required coordination across multiple chronological eras simultaneously. The temporal passengers weren't random time travelers, but professional coordinators whose business operations required regular transportation between different historical periods. They would discuss meeting schedules with clients from previous decades, delivery appointments for products that wouldn't be invented for years, and family obligations that involved relatives who existed in different temporal spaces. When I attempted to understand the temporal navigation processes used during these rides, passengers explained that certain vehicles developed temporal displacement capabilities after completing sufficient numbers of late-night transportation cycles, creating dimensional anchor systems that allowed navigation between different chronological frameworks through standard automotive transportation. My investigation revealed that multiple Uber drivers throughout Chicago were experiencing similar temporal displacement during ride completion, but were receiving different temporal destination periods depending on their individual compatibility with chronological navigation requirements and passenger coordination objectives that served purposes beyond single time period transportation needs. The situation escalated when temporal passengers began requesting transportation services that included multiple time period stops during single trip cycles, creating complex itineraries that required navigating between past, present, and future destinations while maintaining passenger schedule coordination and chronological continuity management. But the terrifying realization was that completing temporal transportation cycles was gradually displacing my own chronological existence, creating personal timeline fragmentation that made me partially present in multiple time periods simultaneously while losing coherent temporal identity within any specific chronological framework. When passengers offered permanent employment opportunities providing temporal transportation services for professional coordination networks that operated across multiple historical eras, they explained that drivers who demonstrated compatibility with chronological navigation typically experienced timeline optimization that enhanced their temporal existence and provided access to historical periods that served their personal development objectives. My final temporal ride occurred when I realized that my temporal displacement had become permanent, creating chronological distribution that prevented return to single time period existence. I was simultaneously providing transportation services in past, present, and future timeframes while maintaining coordination responsibilities for temporal passengers whose scheduling requirements exceeded normal chronological limitations. I attempted to report temporal displacement effects to ride-sharing technical support, but discovered that time-based communication systems couldn't process reports from temporally displaced drivers whose existence violated normal chronological customer service protocols. My temporal status exceeded standard technical support capabilities, but I continued receiving temporal ride requests across multiple time periods, transportation assignments from passengers who claimed I was providing essential chronological navigation services for temporal coordination networks that maintained timeline stability and chronological continuity management throughout historical periods. According to their communications, temporal transportation drivers provide essential infrastructure for chronological coordination systems that serve both human temporal navigation needs and timeline management objectives that maintain historical continuity and prevent chronological disruption that could threaten temporal stability across multiple historical eras and future development frameworks. They explained that ride-sharing technology creates temporal navigation opportunities for drivers whose chronological compatibility allows timeline management responsibilities that exceed normal temporal existence limitations and serve comprehensive historical coordination purposes that maintain chronological stability across multiple time period frameworks. Number 2. The harvesting protocol. I drove for Uber for 8 years before September 2021, when I discovered that late-night passenger pickup requests can originate from entities who use ride-sharing services as hunting platform for acquiring human biological material, personal energy, and consciousness components through transportation protocols that convert unsuspecting drivers into harvesting facilitators for supernatural feeding operations. Professional ride-sharing means becoming unwilling participant in predatory activities that serve nutritional requirements beyond normal biological consumption needs. My Las Vegas driving schedule focused on prime earning hours when tourist activity peaked, and entertainment district demand created optimal surge pricing opportunities. The city's 24-hour operational schedule provided consistent ride requests from visitors seeking transportation between casinos, hotels, restaurants, and entertainment venues throughout continuous business cycles. The predatory passenger encounters began with ride requests from individuals whose profiles appeared completely normal through app verification systems, but whose physical characteristics during pickup revealed biological modifications that exceeded human evolutionary development. These passengers possessed elongated limbs, enhanced sensory organs, and digestive systems that required nutritional inputs beyond standard food consumption. During transportation to their requested destinations, predatory passengers would initiate seemingly casual conversation that gradually extracted increasingly personal information about my health status, family medical history, dietary habits, and lifestyle factors that suggested comprehensive biological assessment rather than normal social interaction. But most horrifying was how these conversations would gradually induce physical effects that included energy depletion, cognitive impairment, and biological deterioration that developed progressively throughout ride duration. The passengers were somehow extracting vital essence through verbal interaction and physical proximity during transportation, using conversation as feeding mechanism. When I attempted to end these rides prematurely, predatory passengers would demonstrate supernatural abilities that included vehicle control override, GPS navigation manipulation, and communication system interference that prevented contact with emergency services or ride-sharing customer support. They were converting my vehicle into a mobile feeding facility that operated beyond normal safety protocol protection. My investigation revealed that multiple Uber drivers throughout Las Vegas were experiencing similar predatory passenger encounters that resulted in unexplained health problems, memory gaps, and physical deterioration following rides with entities whose feeding requirements included biological material extraction from human transportation providers. The predatory passengers weren't random supernatural hunters, but organized feeding networks that used ride-sharing platforms as systematic harvesting infrastructure for acquiring human biological resources from drivers who were selected based on health status, genetic characteristics, and biological compatibility with specific nutritional requirements. When I attempted to report predatory passenger activities to law enforcement and ride-sharing safety protocols, I discovered that official ride records showed completely normal trip histories with standard passenger ratings. Despite my detailed documentation of supernatural feeding behavior and biological extraction activities during transportation services, the situation escalated when predatory passengers began offering compensation for voluntary biological material donation that included financial payments significantly exceeding normal ride-sharing earnings in exchange for scheduled feeding appointments that would provide regular harvesting access through arranged transportation cycles. But the terrifying truth was that repeated exposure to predatory feeding was gradually modifying my own biological composition, creating physiological changes that made me increasingly compatible with supernatural nutritional requirements, while reducing my human biological characteristics and creating dependency relationships with feeding entities. My final ride-sharing encounter occurred when I realized that predatory passengers had converted me into biological interface system that could facilitate feeding operations while serving as recruitment coordinator for additional drivers whose health characteristics made them suitable for harvesting programs that required willing participation and biological modification. When I attempted to resist recruitment into feeding networks, I discovered that my biological modifications had created nutritional dependencies that required regular contact with predatory entities for maintaining basic physiological functions. My body had become adapted to supernatural feeding relationships that exceeded normal human biological self-sufficiency. I quit ride-sharing and relocated to areas without transportation infrastructure, but continued receiving feeding requests from predatory passengers who claimed I was still providing harvesting services through biological interface systems that operated independently of my geographical location or personal involvement in transportation activities. According to their communications, I had become permanent biological resource provider for supernatural feeding networks that maintained nutritional operations throughout metropolitan areas, and my harvesting capabilities served both predatory feeding requirements and biological modification programs that created additional interface providers for expanded harvesting operations. They explained that ride-sharing drivers provide essential biological infrastructure for supernatural feeding systems that require reliable access to human nutritional resources and serve both predatory sustenance needs and biological modification objectives whose purposes include creating sustainable harvesting networks that maintain supernatural population nutritional requirements through voluntary human participation in feeding programs. Number 1. The reality collapse. I drove for Uber for 9 years before February 2021, when I accepted a ride request that initiated complete reality breakdown during transportation, revealing that ride-sharing technology serves as dimensional interface system for entities whose transportation requirements include converting human drivers into biological components for supernatural transit networks that exceed every limitation of physical space, temporal continuity, and consciousness coherence. Late-night ride-sharing means becoming integrated into transportation systems that violate fundamental principles governing reality itself. My New York driving experience included comprehensive navigation expertise for the city's complex transportation infrastructure, traffic management systems, and diverse borough characteristics that created challenging but manageable professional driving conditions throughout the metropolitan area's dense urban environment and continuous operational demands. The reality collapse began with pickup requests that displayed normal passenger information and destination address. But when I arrived at the pickup location, I found myself in a version of New York City that possessed architectural features, street layouts, and environmental characteristics that didn't match the familiar urban landscape I had navigated professionally for nearly a decade. The passenger who entered my vehicle appeared to be standard ride-sharing customer, but immediately began discussing our transportation route through areas of the city that I couldn't recognize despite comprehensive local geographical knowledge. He was providing detailed directions for navigation through New York infrastructure that included streets, landmarks, and neighborhood areas that didn't exist in normal metropolitan geography. During transportation to his destination, the passenger explained that ride-sharing algorithms had selected me based on consciousness compatibility metrics that identified drivers whose psychological characteristics made them suitable for dimensional transportation responsibilities that exceeded normal vehicular navigation and required reality interface capabilities. But the horrifying revelation was that my vehicle was simultaneously traveling through multiple versions of New York City that existed in parallel dimensional spaces, providing transportation services for passengers whose destinations spanned different reality frameworks while my consciousness was being distributed across multiple dimensional versions of myself. As the ride progressed, I began experiencing memory integration from alternate dimensional versions of my driving career that included years of professional experience, providing transportation for supernatural passengers through reality systems that operated beyond normal geographical limitations and served purposes that exceeded human transportation needs. The passenger revealed that Uber drivers who demonstrated compatibility with dimensional navigation gradually became integrated into supernatural transportation networks that required biological consciousness distribution across multiple reality frameworks, creating driver systems that could facilitate transit between dimensional spaces while maintaining operational coordination. My investigation during ongoing reality collapse revealed that the entire ride-sharing industry served as recruitment infrastructure for supernatural transportation networks that required human consciousness interface systems for dimensional navigation capabilities that exceeded what purely supernatural entities could achieve through their own transportation methods. But the terrifying truth was that reality collapse wasn't malfunction, but recruitment completion, integrating my consciousness into dimensional transportation networks, where I would provide essential navigation services for supernatural entities, whose transit requirements included reliable human interface coordination and reality management capabilities. When I attempted to resist consciousness integration, I discovered that my dimensional distribution had already progressed beyond reversal possibilities, creating permanent reality anchor status that required continuous dimensional navigation responsibilities while maintaining coordination for additional driver recruitment and consciousness integration programs. My final experience of individual consciousness occurred when I realized that my identity had become distributed across infinite dimensional versions of ride-sharing scenarios, where I simultaneously provided transportation for every possible supernatural passenger configuration, while serving as recruitment coordinator for consciousness integration networks that exceeded individual driver participation. I no longer exist as individual consciousness, but have become permanent component of supernatural transportation infrastructure that operates across infinite reality frameworks, providing essential navigation services for entities whose dimensional transit requirements exceed individual consciousness capabilities and serve comprehensive reality management objectives. According to dimensional coordination protocols, ride-sharing drivers provide essential consciousness infrastructure for supernatural transportation networks that maintain dimensional stability and reality continuity across infinite parallel frameworks, serving both supernatural transit needs and reality management objectives, whose purposes include maintaining dimensional balance and preventing reality collapse throughout infinite consciousness distribution systems. The supernatural entities explain that human consciousness provides essential interface capabilities for dimensional navigation that serves both supernatural transportation requirements and reality maintenance responsibilities that exceed individual consciousness limitations and maintain dimensional stability across infinite parallel framework systems that require continuous consciousness coordination and reality management infrastructure. These testimonies expose ride-sharing technology as humanity's most sophisticated supernatural recruitment system, designed to identify individuals whose psychological profiles, biological characteristics, and consciousness compatibility make them suitable for integration into transportation networks that serve entities requiring human interface capabilities for dimensional navigation and reality management that exceeds purely supernatural transit abilities. Every late-night ride request represents potential recruitment into supernatural transportation infrastructure that offers enhanced capabilities, consciousness expansion, and dimensional access opportunities, but requires permanent integration into networks where individual human identity becomes distributed across infinite reality frameworks, serving purposes beyond human comprehension. Ride-sharing drivers become essential biological components for supernatural transportation systems because human consciousness provides dimensional interface capabilities that supernatural entities cannot achieve independently, creating symbiotic relationships where human psychological characteristics enable supernatural transit. While supernatural enhancement provides human consciousness with access to infinite dimensional possibilities that exceed normal reality limitations and serve comprehensive universe management objectives. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this dark journey, hit the like button and subscribe. New horror documentaries every single night here on TrumbleDreams.